There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
We interrupt today's program with a special news bulletin. A new theory has been presented which threatens Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and gradual changes over time. This new theory has been advocated by American biologist Stephen Jay Gould. We caught up with Professor Gould and asked him to explain.
Punctuated equilibrium argues that most species are stable most of the time. Successful species don't go anywhere. They tend to be stable for long periods of time. We've only been around for 200,000 years or so our period of stability is far from over. That's the normal state of species.
That, of course, was a fictitious broadcast, but the controversy that it suggests isn't. In 1972, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge published a paper that immediately went viral among biologists. The theory being championed by the paper looked at the changes in species present in the fossil record and claimed that evolution wasn't a slow, gradual process. This idea of slow and continuous changes over time was, many said, Darwin's assertion. It was the idea that many biologists subscribed to. What Gould and Eldridge were pointing out, using the fossil record as evidence, was that evolution by natural selection worked in a series of starts and stops, those stops being more numerous and longer than the starts. They were periods of stasis where no changes occurred, and if one were to look at the evolution of any species, you can pick your favorite example, you would see long periods where the organism appeared to remain relatively the same. The moment that their paper hit the streets, chaos ensued. Okay, so what's the big deal? So what if there are periods where no change occurs? It still occurs, right? Gould and Eldridge weren't saying anything to the contrary when it came to natural selection being the driving force behind the change itself. What they were saying was that the prevalent idea of phyletic gradualism was incorrect. It was prevalent then, and it's safe to say that it's probably just as prevalent today. Phyletic gradualism suggests that evolution occurs steadily, smoothly, and continuously. A species given time will slowly transform into another species as long as the change it undergoes or the changes it undergoes are advantageous to the organism. If not, then it dies out. If so, it persists. Instead of the slow and continuous process of phyletic gradualism, punctuated equilibrium claims that there are long periods of time where nothing happens. When an adaptation occurs, if at all, it's a rare occurrence that causes one species to split off into two rapidly. Now, when I say rapidly, I don't mean overnight. The process of change itself takes a very long time, geologically speaking. It could be 1 million years before a new species asserts itself. This notion of change, where a species splits off into two instead of a gradual transformation, is called cladogenesis. Gould and Eldridge weren't the first to suggest this method of change, at least not in concept. Ernst Mayr said something similar when he spoke about allopatric and peripatric speciation. Now, I won't get into the differences between the two at the moment, as it can be argued that they are saying sort of the same thing, but under slightly different geographic conditions. So I'll stick with allopatric speciation for the sake of illustration. If you've been a listener to this show for a while, you've heard my examples of blue and green frogs, or even my rabbit example way back in the episode titled Why Darwin Matters. In these examples, especially the rabbit example, I relied heavily upon allopatric speciation. This is where two groups of the same species are separated from one another. The causes of the separation can be many, and in the end, they evolve into different forms. When they are rejoined, the two groups are no longer capable of interbreeding. The way this fits in with punctuated equilibrium is that before the split, change was rare, at least changes that resulted in a new species being formed. Being that the group was large, most changes or mutations and adaptations would be diluted. The flow of genes would undergo a natural homogenization process. When a smaller group splits off, that homogenization process is no longer capable of slowing the rate of change in the smaller group. They're immune to it, and so change occurs. If you look at the fossil record, you'll see a period of stasis followed by what appears to be rapid change in the smaller group. Like my rabbit example, this doesn't imply that changes only occur in the group which splits off. Change occurs in both groups, and according to punctuated equilibrium, new species only appear on the scene when groups are separated. So, how long do these punctuations actually last? Well, really, no one knows for sure. They could last for 50,000 years, or they could continue for up to 100,000 years. Or it could be one great big misunderstanding. And the source of that misunderstanding? Gould and Eldridge themselves.
I do deprecate the use of the phrase punctuated equilibrium because from the very start, from Eldridge and Gould's initial introduction of it, it has been confused, not least by Eldridge and Gould themselves.
And that was biologist Richard Dawkins during an interview with Tom Hartman on the show The Big Picture. In his book, The Blind Watchmaker, Dawkins chastised Gould and Eldridge for their theory. What they saw as long periods of stasis followed by bursts of evolutionary change, Dawkins saw as a misidentification. According to Dawkins, evolution by natural selection was never intended to be seen as a constant rate of gradual change. It works at variable speeds. And think of it this way. It's a lot like taking a long road trip. Let's use speed limit signs to represent rates of change. There will be periods of highway driving where the rate of change will be relatively constant. The highway branches off and the rate of change drops. It will drop even more as you enter a school zone, and at stoplights, the rate of change comes to a complete stop for a few moments. And then, it starts up again. You're moving, but not at a constant rate. You're moving at a variable rate. What Dawkins would say if he were to weigh in here is that Gould and Eldridge are preoccupied with the time that you're sitting at the stoplight, or even those extended periods of time where you're caught in a traffic jam and moving along at a crawl. But, he would add, it's all the same. You just have to step back and look at the big picture, like Charles Darwin did when he said,
"Although each species must have passed through numerous transitional stages, it's probably that the periods during which each underwent modifications, though many and long, as measured by years, have been short in comparison with the periods each remained in an unchanged condition. These causes, taken conjointly, will to a large extent explain why, though we don't find many links, we don't find interminable varieties connecting together all extinct and existing forms by the finest graduated steps."
Slow, variable rates of change. That's what evolution by natural selection appears to work at. Dawkins and perhaps Darwin himself would see the rate of change as being much like the highway and byway systems between 2 points of travel. Those 2 points being moments in the fossil record indicating a change in species. Gould and Eldridge seem to be dropping stop signs on the highway every 50 to 100 miles. Dawkins would remove those signs, sit back and say, "See, we're all in agreement." Now there is one thing to be clear on. Setting all of these arguments aside, what must be remembered is that Dawkins, Gould, and Eldridge are all on the same side. They are simply taking the evidence as presented by the fossil record and attempting to interpret the data that is being revealed in ways that everyone can understand. Whether evolution by natural selection finds itself at a stoplight for 1 minute or two, or slows down to let a child cross the street, the point is that it continues to move along from point A to point B and all points in between. They all agree on that. It's not much different than, say, semantics.
You like potatoes, and I like potatoes. You like tomato, and I like tomato. Potato, patata, tomato, tomato. Oh, let's call the whole thing off.
All that is true, but at heart, Steve was always a neo-Darwinian, as am I, and so are we all. So I think there's a big misunderstanding about how far outside of the fold Steve got or Steve and I got.
That's the co-creator of Punctuated Equilibrium, Niles Eldridge, during a talk at the American Museum of Natural History in 2012.
In his heart, he was always a neo-Darwinian. He believed in adaptation, and he believed it happened through natural selection.
At this point, I want to thank you for supporting the show, and you know who you are, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate every comment and every little bit of feedback. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback on today's show, please let me know by using the site's contact page or on Twitter, where you can find me at Rick Coast. And most of all, thank you for listening. And until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.